Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining in again to day 2 of the session. We'll just wait for a minute more and then we'll begin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Warm welcome to the second day of the Global Carbon Markets training. Thank you all for taking time out to join this training. We would like to now just move on to the housekeeping rules and quickly move to the contents. Next slide, please. So just to recap on the housekeeping rules for anyone who has joined in new for the day, participants will be on mute mode for most of the session. However, you may raise your hands or box. Interpretation is available in Bahasa, in Chinese, as well as in Vietnamese. If you would like to move on to listen more clearly, you may mute your original audio so that you do not necessarily have to listen to it in English as well. We will be using the AHA slides again for the interactive sessions. And thank you everybody yesterday who filled in the evaluation forms. They really helped us in reassessing the training as well as to answer some of your queries that for today. So we encourage you to, again, after the session, please fill up the evaluation form as it really helps us in improving the experience for you all. Thank you once again. I would now like to hand it over to Mr. Zot to take us through the recap of yesterday as well as through the training for today. Thank you so much. Over to you, Zot.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. And once more, apologies for my voice. My coughing may get a bit of an interruption. It has improved since yesterday. So I think I try to be not only be more pleasant to those who are interested in the nitty-gritty and of the actual implementation of carbon market mechanisms, but also to all of you with a slightly better toned voice today. So as an introduction, I really would like to recap what we discussed yesterday for those who might have missed that introduction, which was clearly on more on the theoretical level and more on the economics, so to say, and the regulatory background of carbon markets. I also would like to recall what we discussed in the introduction yesterday with the IPCC latest report actually being published yesterday, really urging everyone in a concerted anticipatory global action, both on adaptation and on mitigation, because otherwise we will be literally burning ourselves. I think this is ammunition for all of us to actually argue for the urgency. With respect to the details, hold on, I think I have an issue with the slide. Just 1 second.
You'll just have to make it into slideshow mode.
Just 1 second, because I think I opened the wrong slide for today. Yep. Well, sorry for that. So what I wanted to recall from yesterday, by obviously opening the wrong slide, was the fact that we covered the underpinnings of these markets, really the background what is necessary to get a bit of a theoretical understanding why we all pursue carbon pricing as a solution. What we discussed was covering a lot about how and why a market failure can be addressed actually by changing the rules of the markets, and how putting a price on carbon would actually change everything in the way how we change the world without putting a price on carbon. Now we are able to fix this. And on that, we looked at the two different approaches by setting a price on carbon, for setting a price on carbon through emission trading systems, which are setting a particular target on emissions and driving our physical emissions in that direction with a price and a technological discovery, ensuring that we actually reach those targets what we set, or looking at using prices on their own, setting carbon taxes, and with the taxes driving the emissions in the directions what we want to achieve. Obviously, what we want to achieve is very simple. Those are the Paris Agreement set targets, aiming at keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. Today, we will really talk about all those nitty-gritties of the carbon markets, and I really appreciated some of your comments raised in the evaluation that we really need to move from the theoretical to the practical. And bear with me, today and tomorrow, or sorry, Friday, will pretty much on these practicalities. We will really be looking at those mechanisms, how they work. We would obviously start today with a quick completion of that theoretical or regulatory overview by looking at the revenue use within these systems, ensuring that we actually see what happens with that price which is put on carbon if it is raised through selling allowances by a government and initiating an emission trading scheme, or by simply taxing carbon and then having these revenues. But as soon as we finish this session in about 20-25 minutes, we will be ensuring that we are really moving to the project level. And that's something I appreciate. Now I see that the key messages, the presentation, which I couldn't find, is now coming up on the screen, and is shared with you. Can I have the next slide, please? So these were the key messages. And what really inspired me yesterday, that when we raised this question, even part of the introduction on how much do you know, what sort of instruments you are aware of, we have created this word cloud, really detailing and showing how emission trading systems and carbon taxes are really well known by now. So, after 2 decades of efforts by, global players of really introducing these things, we are in a situation where we do have a lot of understanding and a lot of knowledge built up, and within that knowledge base, you are all participating. Can I have the next slide, please? So, yes, yesterday we really concluded, and I think that's probably also a varying message, that this is an extremely complex field. So carbon pricing may look very simple. As Antonio Guterres says, put a price on carbon and with that we will be on the right track. That's true, but we also agreed and concluded that this is only part of the picture. A large number of other policies and measures are actually necessary to address this. And then we looked at the complementary elements, the complementary policies and measures, which actually help these issues work together. We looked at those which are overlapping and sometimes acting in a conflictual manner. One is helping the other and perhaps not really moving most efficiently in terms of a regulatory perspective. And we also explored a few which are really contradicting, and fossil fuel subsidies are one of those clearly, where we actually have a negative price on carbon adding money to those who are actually polluting in a very heavy way. And that was also the point where we really captured the audience knowledge on these complexities, moving really to the entirety of the policy field, looking at health issues, labor issues, poverty, and rural development, you name it. These are all the issues but always need to be kept in mind, and this word crowd actually captures that discussion about the inherent complexities and interconnections. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, and with that, I would be happy to take over presenting, and move into that last and very short theoretical session. Just in a second, because somehow I need to get screen sharing once more. I think let me just stop sharing because it's just not coming up. So once more, I try to share my screen.
Yes, it's clear now.
And you see it in presenting mode because somehow on my screen, it's still stuck in.
No, we see it in presenting mode. So.
Okay. And is it moving? So now you see the content file?
No, just the first thing. So I'll share my screen and maybe you can continue.
Yes, 1 second, because I guess it's really odd. Just a second. Shall I just stop sharing and once more? Oh, now it's okay.
Yes.
Is it? Now you see the content. Well, sorry for these glitches. Apparently, technology is still far stronger than us. So in the very last theoretical session, we really look at this important thing that if we are generating revenues, what we do by putting a price on carbon, what happens with that revenue? How that could be used most effectively, and from our perspective, is it actually used for climate change mitigation or adaptation and building resilience? So we will be quickly looking at carbon pricing as a source of government revenue. So we are not only looking at why we raise that funding, not only look at how we actually create that revenue, but what is that source of government revenue. We would look at very briefly how this is actually generated and used worldwide, what and how one can govern the use of these revenues, and how one can use it. So the learning objectives is really simple from this perspective. We would really try to be able to answer after this session, how these revenues can be strategically used and generate tangible benefits, and how these revenues can support further climate action, but obviously how they can actually be used for other purposes as well. So seeing that as another area for actual regulation and attention, both for policymakers and also for businesses and civil society organizations. You should not lose track of the money which is collected through carbon taxation or emission trading schemes. So when we look at the revenue, it's really simple. When it comes to an emission trading system, you could actually raise these revenues through selling those allowances. Those permits which entities are getting obviously comes at a price, and that price is coming to the government budget. This revenue is really easy to see how the allowance price and the allowances are being sold, are multiplied, and then you actually have a revenue. But one needs to remember that whenever you introduce an emission trading system, you normally start with free allowances in order to seduce the installations into the system. So normally, auctioning and actual selling by the government of these allowances is a small proportion at start, and then it increases over time. We will come back to the European emission trading system as an example, and you will see how these revenues have been raising and how they are used over time. Obviously, a carbon tax is really something where the calculation from the government perspective is even easier. As soon as it is agreed and goes into live mode, then you would have a tax rate, and then you would have the actual emissions emitted being monitored, and then the revenue and the revenue is easily set, and then you just receive that taxation yearly or whatever the taxation period. So the idea that we discussed is internalization of that external cost of carbon, and then the whole machinery really goes through these very simple methods of either buying the allowances which are required in order to actually issue that particular carbon, or obviously based on the emissions which occur, the tax is actually set. One thing is very important, and we really need to come back to that later. This is a system which first generates huge revenues, potentially, because of the high amount of emissions. But as we expect these emissions to fall, these emissions are going down. So if you combine that historic lesson from the introduction of emission trading systems of low amount of allowances being sold, which reduces the revenue, so it's basically building up over time. But then by the time it builds up, it may be actually going down very dramatically because the amount of emissions are falling. You know, there are two factors, and that the factor is the amount of being emitted, and the other is the unit price or the taxation unit. So it's also possible that despite the volumes going down over time, which is our goal, the prices or the tax can still go up. So somehow the government can actually plan a rather steady revenue from these particular sources. And obviously, if you ask any government budgeting expert, revenue planning is always very crucial. Governments really want to know how much they can expect from a particular scheme. From an emission trading scheme where allowance prices can fluctuate, there is a question mark. And in a taxation scheme where the volume may be actually going down, the tax could be increased, so one can manage this. You may not be surprised that if you talk to budgetary experts who really want to see steady or at least known revenues by a government, they may favor the tax. Whilst obviously we have argued yesterday, I think hopefully very convincingly, that an emission trading scheme from an economic perspective, from the perspective of really delivering the lowest cost emission reductions is to be favored. This was actually a question what you raised yesterday in our chat and in our final evaluation, and I just wanted to highlight that yes, there are, depending on who you are in the government, you might have very different answers of your preferences when it comes to these systems, when it comes to actually policy choices on deciding whether or not to use emission trading or taxation of carbon. Then let me just move to the first question of the day, and this is number 14. So I ask my colleagues to bring that up in the AHA slides, making sure that it's number 14, which is brought up. And then I would just like to ask a few rather tricky questions, and apologies for that, but I thought that this is also a good way of waking up the audience at the beginning. So I am offering you 5 answers on what is impacting emission trading and carbon tax revenues, and this is a multiple correct choice. So there are some statements which are actually not true. So I'm asking my colleagues to bring up the AHA slides, and then as soon as you see answers coming in, then we would be actually switching to their screen. Aha. And now we have a number. Can we just please move to the next AHA slide? I think, yeah, I guess we messed up the numbers. Yes, this is the one where I would like to ask your answers coming in. And as you are putting down your answers, I mean, let me say that, again, don't feel embarrassed. These are really, really, really tricky issues. And sometimes the very government experts who are actually setting these issues up are troubled with the answers. So we will see what comes out. But I just wanted to sort of show that from a governmental function, which is setting budgets, it's really, really important to understand the complexities in this field. And as we discussed yesterday, there are a large number of really, really complex interactions between other policies as well. So this is by no means an easy field. And then, yeah. But I think you got it right, and I'm glad to see that on the simplest views on the bigger the coverage, the higher the revenues is the sort of overall general truth, and the rest is really, really detail in which I guess we would all need to be engaged with, but certainly this is an issue that we can deal with later on. Let me just take back the screen. So let's just very quickly look how carbon revenues are evolving over time. And I think there is just one very, very clear message. This is something which is becoming mainstream. And from the breakdown, you would really, really see how there is almost like a 50-50 split emerging on carbon taxation and on emission trading systems. And then if we are looking at the detail, then we can really, really capture a handful of interesting lessons. In the inner sector, you would really see.
We can't see your slides at the moment. It's still on the content slide.
Hold on. Then again, should I just stop sharing? And yeah, I see, because hold on, just a second. Yeah, today somehow we have some glitches with the slide sharing. So. Can you see now the?
Yes.
Yeah.
The revenue evolution slide. Yes.
Yeah. And hold on, I just do a quick change on my video setting, because apparently this is what mixes up the system. Yep. And then I think both I am visible and the screen is visible. So what I meant to say is that by now we do have this 50-50 split between the revenues. of emission trading system generated revenues and carbon taxation. And if we look at the way how this is being used, now do you see the slides? Yes. Then you would have a really intriguing breakdown. And I think it's really important to show how and what are the countries where this is really being generated. And then you will really see a big split, that the European Union emission trading system is still generating the lion's share of government revenues when it comes to ETS-related revenues. And when it comes to carbon taxation, obviously a large number of countries are doing this, including a handful of European Union countries. I mean, you would see France and Sweden. You may recall Sweden having the highest carbon tax in the world historically, and even at this moment. But then also you see another a handful of countries all around the world, being Japan or British Columbia, a Canadian province. So this is the inner circle, and you see the split, and you actually see what are the countries where these lessons can really be learned because of historic reasons on emission trading systems and carbon taxation. The outer circle, which is indicated by a number 2, then really shows how these revenues are being used. And this is obviously an extremely interesting insight, really realizing that a large number of countries, a large number of jurisdictions, being the European emission trading system or Japan, are really earmarking these revenues. And they are earmarking it for climate purposes. So the way how these systems are designed from the start are really linking the revenue generation to climate change mitigation. What they say is that let's look at particular issues, and these particular issues could be very different, such as just transition, could be energy industry transformation, could really be anything, or industrial competitiveness in these particular fields. And then let's ensure that whatever we collect from the carbon price, be it an allowance or be it a carbon tax, is actually earmarked very specifically in a legally binding manner to be used in these fields. The other extreme, which again you will see with yellow in the outer circle, is general budget allocation, which obviously doesn't mean that this money is not having an impact on climate change, but it's not that direct and it's not that very visible. It's the way how taxes are normally collected. When we pay taxes, we don't really know which direction of the state operations it goes, but they are being, again, used normally in an adequate and very effective number. And then there are particular solutions where direct transfers are being made, and on that you would see the purple. And Canada is one example which really came up with that challenge, or faced that challenge on how to increase taxes. And then obviously the opposition for that was very high. So a system was designed which actually returns whatever is collected as a carbon tax part of the personal income tax to particular proportion or particular vulnerable parts, normally the poorer parts, the not so well-off parts of society. So you would even get in British Columbia your tax bill showing that how much you paid or how much was charged as a carbon tax and how much reductions you are getting back from your own personal income tax in order to balance this out. And that's something which also happens, and which also happens in a manner where you are really being informed about these things. You are also getting particular tax credit for your own climate mitigation investments, which are all supported by the taxes on carbon. And then you have a few angles where you could get tax exemptions, which is also a similar way to direct transfers to particular population parts or particular entities who are paying this tax. So overall, it's always to be remembered that the money which comes in really need to be tracked. And from my own climate perspective, obviously I am in favor of earmarking, But when general budget allocation takes place, then you also need to look at how green your overall budget is, and then you may realize that these are really, really great contributions for greening budgets on a national scale. So the question, which I think I already alluded to, that there is a big question when it comes to budgeting that you really you would always face. And as soon as you meet your finance ministry in these policy discussions, they will really be pointing to these points, whether this is it's a decreasing revenue, and how to plan its level. And this is very unlikely, it's a very unlikely behavior that in the short and medium term, this is likely to bring in more money, but as it actually succeeds, it will likely to be evaporating over time. I mean, if you consider that we will reach net zero by 2050, 60, 70, whatever, in your particular constituency, then you could really say that, well, on that day, there will be no revenues from such source. And this is clearly an issue, both for the earmarking and also for the general budget use, because you need to plan in advance that this is a shrinking revenue source. And this is very unusual, because if you consider any other taxes, from income taxes to value-added taxes, this is not the case. Tax revenues are normally stable, but definitely they are not set in a manner that actually they will evaporate. And this is an issue which needs to be addressed up front, because otherwise you would really, really face major regulatory challenges or really nasty surprises within your budget. And certainly the environment, the climate ministries negotiating with the finance ministry are not the ones who are pushing their own agendas. It's ministries of finance who happens to be the gods of governments, very simply because they sit on the purse, they sit on the budget, and in that discussion they obviously deserve to be well informed. So when it comes to the administration and governance arrangements, just very briefly, let me state the obvious, that very clear legal and administrative frameworks are really, really, really needed in order to get these arrangements. Existing systems can really be used for revenue allocation. So if you are earmarking, then it's really, really simple to use the existing systems to actually spend that money which is coming in. Obviously, when it comes to agreeing on these details, what we have been discussing yesterday is really important here as well. This must be done in a very broad, very inclusive stakeholder discussion. And that also really links to the credibility of these systems. Unless the spending, the revenues coming from these schemes are completely transparent and discussed, people would not see the benefits, the full benefits of this, because obviously they would just not be aware of how these funds are being used. And obviously, if they are earmarked and they are actually helping climate mitigation, then the population would really accept the double benefit. The price is actually driving down the consumption of heavy polluting services and goods, giving the signals to actually move away from them, whilst obviously all that revenue which is generated through that price signal is actually recycled and used for accelerating that change. So the fiscal policy considerations, again, are something that you need to be prepared to discuss with your Ministry of Finance colleagues. Efficiency is obviously a key issue on how to allocate public and private resources to their best societal use. It is something where the short, the medium, and the long-term elements could well be different, and then this really needs to support a long-run green growth. And the angle what we discussed yesterday in depth on how distributional impacts, how the impact on vulnerable societal groups always needs to be looked at. And obviously this also needs to be looked at from how to expand economic opportunities through job creations in these particular groups through these revenues always needs to be kept in mind. So just to recap, the basic revenue use sort of overall context. It really, everything depends on how a particular jurisdiction, which is normally a country, sets priorities and what circumstances they are operating in. As with the tools, what we discussed yesterday, there are different ways, markedly different ways and potential how to use these revenues. The two extremes, or the two parts of this continuum, is really earmarking for climate change mitigation, hopefully, or even adaptation and resilience or resilient infrastructure. And then you can get the other extreme when it enters the general budget. But even then, one needs to keep an eye on how this is being used or how green your budget is at the first place. And then the angle which I think one always need to keep in mind is really the trade-off between the visible use, the visibility and the use and the allocation of these revenues, of how they are being used and how they are tracked over time. So just a summary slide on the 5 issues which you would always keep in mind, with the underlying element that you need to really look at all these aspects in order to generate the support for the instrument. You can be very persuasive at the first place and introduce these systems, what we discussed yesterday, but if you end up not addressing the distributional impacts, not making it visible how they are being used, then public acceptance will not increase. Actually, it can really evaporate, and people would rightly conclude that this is just another ways, a very smart way actually, to raise taxes. And if you think of some particular movements, the yellow vest in France in particular, there are clear signs of what happens when this is not really calculated, this is not really communicated, despite all the good will behind the systems, and if the use of these funds are not transparently shared with those who are actually paying for it, then you are up for a trouble. So let me just skip this, and then. So just an issue which I think, in order to be consistent with yesterday's discussion, where we looked at how carbon prices impacts all those issues within sustainable development, in that sort of broader perspective for development from a particular country. So if you just look the way how these revenues could be used for sustainable development, supporting and funding health system improvements, water security and clean water, ecosystem services, looking at biodiversity, impacts even of those fossil or non-fossil fuel energy use, or any other emissions, or including agriculture. You can look at education, not to forget that if we had spent far more on incorporating climate as a subject into our education systems in the last 30 years, we would have different politicians now. We would be facing a far smaller challenge in terms of changing the world, because the sheer challenge of the climate crisis would have been far better known, understood, and then finishing with infrastructure, on which I think it's absolutely essential to say that for many options where you need and where you want to change even your personal behavior, the underlying infrastructure is the real bottleneck. I think yesterday we used some examples from the transport sector, highlighting that yes, indeed, you can push electrification of personal vehicles, and that's something which requires some infrastructure changes. From petrol stations, you need charging stations for electric cars, but you can also look at the underlying infrastructure in which you create a different infrastructure which actually supports public transportation. But without that infrastructure, you don't have the individual choice. If you have the will and the revenue to change from a more polluting to a less polluting car, obviously you would improve the overall goal. But if you look at model shifts, if you look at a completely different way of urban transportation, what we are used to, then you have obviously far more potential, but that requires fundamental changes in infrastructure. And surprise, surprise, the carbon pricing could actually generate those revenues, those funds, which could be devoted to building resilient and different infrastructure, which allows us moving ahead on a far lower emission pathway. So just using a few examples on how different earmarking could be. Looking at Colombia, just across the world, very much the other side of the world, the idea came up that let's have a carbon tax. And Colombia's carbon tax actually is extremely earmarked, and it has an element which is very specific. And this is the peace process. You might have heard about the FARC, you might have heard about how hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives and millions lost their living spaces for this decades-long insurgency in Colombia, which obviously requires reconstruction of those areas, which even requires a very smart use or reuse of those areas, which intriguingly were somehow protected environmentally, so to say, by the fighting. Obviously, no industrialization occurs when you are fighting, and that's the point where implementing the peace agreement, making sure that these areas are returned to normal life with environmental sustainability criteria included. And then obviously Colombia, with large areas to be protected, also acknowledged that national protected areas should be supported from these funds. So they took an extremely advanced step of setting a carbon tax and putting a price on carbon, and then linked it to their national development priorities, in which obviously the peace process is extremely essential for actually making millions of people's life possible. And you would see that the sums are not staggeringly high. Obviously, Colombia was not in a position to set a very high carbon tax at the start. But this is really a system which provides a very, very good start. And you see from the total investment figures really going up in the climate field, partly because of this additional revenue stream. South Africa is also a place where a very complex plan has been established since for the last 3 years on looking at literally all aspects where you would achieve the energy transition. Obviously, you might have heard about the 8.5 billion going from a few countries, including the EU, to South Africa's just transition and coal phase out. I would argue that, for example, without having this serious attempt on the carbon tax and domestic actions, that decision by these donor countries perhaps would have not come at all, or would have come later. As soon as you are getting serious and you really show your own abilities, that could actually attract additional interest and additional funding from elsewhere. If you have a system in which you are able to recycle revenues, what you have created, others would obviously believe, and rightly believe, that those machinery, those systems which you are implemented on the basis of your own revenue streams could be used to actually use more revenues. We will come back to the Article 6 mechanism later, but I think this is an extremely strong point where South Africa's example must be very inspiring. If you do your homework, if you do those things what you can, and you demonstrate that you have efficient and effective systems, then there will be people lining up to give you more money and to pour that money into those systems, what you actually based and you build on your own carbon revenue at the first place. I think it's really, really important, and I think we come back to this subject on how vulnerable households and communities must be compensated. We really can't put the climate mitigation journey, the costs of changing our energy system to those people who are already spending a far larger proportion of their incomes on energy-related services. This is really, really a must, and on that there are more and more smarter and smarter methods to compensations, and this is really something what always needs to be kept in mind when designing these systems, and that also comes back to the point that we look at very complex systems in which impact assessments needs to be made when introducing them. And as soon as the impact assessment is carried out, one would really see how this impacts vulnerable households and communities, therefore what systems and what interventions you need to put there. So just skipping a few files, I guess, yes, we can all learn from Switzerland, but perhaps it's not the most inspiring example. This is the example what I mentioned about how lowering other taxes could occur. And this is really, really the occasion which I think would have a lot of meaning and would offer a lot of insights. And this is something what has been done again in the rich part of the world, but the lessons on looking at these taxation interactions is something what one needs to explore. Then, obviously, on subsidies and transfers, again, Germany and California are examples on how social inequalities could really be organized. But obviously, that really requires systems where the transfer recipients are known. And that's obviously always requires a rather sophisticated taxation or social security system, which may not be the case all the time. So just wanted to stop for a second on this summary table on how to address inequalities. And then again, you will not be surprised that there are different ways of doing this. And I think the key message here that you just not turn a blind eye on this. The fact that we are acting for a public good, the fact that we are all wholeheartedly committed to climate change mitigation for the very right reasons should not blind us that the address, it can create further inequalities. And inequalities actually would drive emissions further up. So this is the angle which, from the climate justice part, which I think was again an important question in yesterday's discussion, this is really, really essential. And we should obviously conclude that unless these inequalities are addressed in a systemic way in the design of these systems, we would not solve the problems of climate change mitigation and poverty alleviation at the same time. So the way, and this is something which also came up yesterday on how to learn from those who have been doing carbon taxation for 30 years. And Sweden really, really offers itself for a very, very long journey in completely different regulatory environments. Obviously, you are not in a position of going back 30 years when you have the freedom to choose. You don't have any climate concerns. You just try to be introducing something innovative, looking at an issue which was then at that time was seen somehow marginal. But there are some really, really, really striking angles to that. At the time when it was introduced more than 30 years ago, it actually simplified the taxation system. So when someone says that, oh my God, this is an additional tax, this is very complex, you talk about those transfers, you talk about earmarking, you take the Swedish example and you say, hold on, you can do this in a way which simplifies the taxation system as opposed to complicates it. And this is obviously something which can be kept in mind. Obviously, there was the idea that environmental taxes, carbon taxes, and consumption-related taxes were increased and have been increased over time in order to cut income taxes at the first place. And that was obviously combined with measures combined to support low-income households. That's again also the logical way of doing it. You really look at those people who are most affected, and then you can actually fix their taxation and reduce their overall tax burdens by knowing their consumption patterns. And this was really the idea driving this move of shifting income and labor taxes and putting a cost on labor in order to increase or allow environmental taxation to take a major way of restructuring the tax system, and actually ending up in supporting green economic growth. So Sweden, it really provides, I think, an extremely inspiring example for all, because it really shows how carbon pricing and carbon taxation could be built into systems which are better for the people and better for the environment. I don't want to dwell on the limitations and again on the difficulties. This is something what is summarizing how every single step which is being chosen has its own limitations. Again, in a comparative manner, there is obviously regulatory complexity which comes at all time. There is one angle which I think might be useful to remember, and that's the big debate on general budget use of these revenues. If someone in your finance ministry claims that, wow, this is great, but then let's use this for overall debt reduction, which is always a macroeconomic policy tool to make further generations having a slightly better life, or at least that's the way how the argument goes. Obviously, with climate change mitigation, we really want to save further generations from suffering. And this is really the angle where the short-term and the long-term arguments could really clash. And I think we do have very strong arguments why short-term action is absolutely essential, because anything what we do in the short term would define the long term. And that's, to me, the major argument for earmarking and earmarking revenues for immediate action, as opposed to spending those revenues on issues which are medium to long term in their nature. So the key takeaways, and I promise with this we will really say goodbye to all the theoretical stuff and we move to the very practical from the rest of today and for Friday. That all these putting a price on carbon, if it's done in the correct way, if it is done in considering all the trade-offs and all these intricate interactions, and it's done in a transparent manner in the use of these revenues, could actually increase the political and social acceptability of these tools, which would eventually and consequently lead to sustainable development. There are, as with the design of putting a price on carbon, we have a large variety of purposes, tools, and methods to actually use that revenue effectively. And obviously, we have a large number of methods to waste that revenue. Again, we know that how governments can be wasteful and can have their own pet projects as opposed to generate effective change through proper revenues. And then the overall good message, why we really need to be looking at these questions in an increasing manner and in more detail, that there is a very clear trend that carbon revenue is increasing. So we are certainly in the phase where this is in the growing part, because obviously we are definitely not reducing our emissions fast enough. And therefore, this is becoming a more and more important issue. And if you obviously have not started to put a price on carbon yet, then you are certainly at the part when these revenues should and could be increased. And therefore, you need to have the machinery and the experience of these details. And again, as I think advocated the EU ETS as the learning ground for all who want to do emission trading, I really want to advocate all these revenue systems which are shown in these examples, actually globally, to take away all those lessons and samples and methods with which you can establish your system. So with this, I think we are coming to the end of this presentation, and I really would like to ask my colleagues to share questions, comments. We also agreed that today we try to bring up discussions and even live contributions from your side. So if I'm now stopping my screen sharing to see whether I have any questions already raised, and whether we can actually give to the floor to someone from the audience.
Yes, Lord. We have a couple of questions, both in the chat. I think there's a very interesting discussion also going on EV and use of fossil fuels for recharging. However, we can have a question. There is one question on how we could measure and estimate CO2 emission amount in small households. Any tools or equipment, specifically looking at agriculture and the rural sector?
And this is again the perfect question from the perspective of looking at a project-based mechanism, which will be the focus of the rest of the discussion. Obviously, with the emergence of the CDM, again 20 years ago, after the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, establishing that as a project mechanism, these methodological questions came up in a very, very big way. It took exactly the same 6 years to operationalize CDM as it took us now from Paris to Article 6 in Glasgow. And within that period, a lot of methodologies and fundamental principles have been worked out. And then obviously after 2003, a lot more methodologies emerged. So what I would say is that thanks God to the previous infrastructure under the UNFCCC, and that is the flexibility mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, and thanking to domestic action on climate and on development, be it agricultural or rural development, I think we have come up with a huge number of very convincing and very detailed and very location-specific methodologies to actually assess emission levels or emission patterns of, for example, households. And the good thing in this respect that, you know, a rural household in different countries on different continents, depending on their lifestyle, on their work, could be very, very different. And this is all now reflected in those methodologies, where I think the Paris Agreement tries to represent continuity. And when it comes to moving the methodological knowledge, which is a huge wealth, again, with even including controversial elements, to the new world of the Paris instruments, we really need to build on these issues. If you are familiar, if you heard about a program of activities, POAs under CDM, which were really designed to look at a large number of small households, introducing statistical methods, introducing also relevant to particular technologies being used for clean cooking, generating biogas from manure from the cow or the cows of a particular household. These are all issues where we have built a huge amount of knowledge. And I'm very confident that this could actually be moved into the new family of the mechanisms under Article 6. Thank you.
Thanks. There are a couple more questions that we can address. Second question is, how do we think about transition to EV in markets where the grid is still largely reliant on fossil fuels or still transitioning to renewable energy? Could end users of EVs or charging stations potentially benefit from carbon credits, or would grid emissions militate against this?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the favorite examples where as soon as you look at the details and you look at behind the plug, so to say, you realize how complex the system is. Yes, in the moment when you move you change your car from an IC internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, or your bicycle or motorcycle, then you believe that, well, I have done my bit. But obviously, if the grid behind that particular electron is still heavily based on fossil fuel plants, then you actually just shifted your emissions. Instead of you burning it in your car, someone else is burning it somewhere else. Again, there could be even implications where instead of urban pollution from transportation, this might be a remote plant. But obviously, we really want to see that energy being generated through renewable energy, through clean energy. From perspective of carbon credits, this also gets extremely tricky because this is the point where you would want to claim that the electricity what you use for charging your car is green. But on that, instead of carbon credits, you do have green certificates. You do have certificates of origins. So there are regulatory instruments within the electricity markets, which can actually guarantee that the electricity what you get in your car is actually green. But that's, again, an outside and, as discussed yesterday, an overlapping regulatory environment. So there's green certificates and certificate of origin in the electricity market will and should play an extremely important role in ensuring that that shift to transportation electrification is actually happening in a manner which helps that grid becoming greener. But the bottom line here, just to making the choice of using electricity for transportation and electrify whatever processes doesn't mean that that electricity becomes greener. And that's, again, the typical example of the policy challenges, what we have seen yesterday on how they interact and how we always need to look at the full picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Zod. One last question I think we can take is there any mechanism or guideline for or to claim individual carbon credits?
For what purpose on individual carbon credits? I just didn't hear you.
Is there a mechanism or guideline to claim individual carbon credits?
Aha, so to ensure that a carbon credit is sourced by an individual, is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Again, I think the methodologies what I mentioned do really go down to the individual owner of the cook stove or clean cooking equipment. Technically, when they receive a clean cooking equipment with a discount, they don't pay the full price because the price is supported by the carbon credit. I would argue that this is really linking the individual emission performance to these accumulated or aggregated carbon credits
But from the perspective of the individual who participate in such a scheme, or who is getting a solar panel off grid or on grid to the top of his or her house, is individually participating. Obviously, that particular individual may never be able to go on its own to the market. He or she will always go through aggregates. But if you look at clean cooking, solar water heaters in India is an extremely great example and an inspiring example of how particular individuals, very committed, technically very capable individuals, actually created a market. How they were able to support solar water heaters through the generation of carbon revenue and made them affordable to people who would otherwise will not be able to buy it. I would argue that any of those individuals who participated in such a scheme, which was supported financially by CDM POAs, is an actual individual participant in the carbon market. But I think here the answer is that an individual should be able to find a pool of like-minded individuals with whom participation in the carbon market is becoming possible. But yeah, I don't expect that we would be in a situation where one can individually walk up to the market, so to say, to the market, saying that with my clean coke stove, with my efficient lighting, with my solar water heater, with my efficient energy efficient performing equipment, here I am to participate in the carbon market. But through aggregations, through market mechanisms, this is indeed possible.
Thanks, Ot. I think we can move on to the next series of presentations, and the other questions we can address subsequently. You're on mute, Ot.
Thank you, Pratibha, for collecting and reviewing the questions. And yeah, we try not to leave all the others without an answer, but obviously we try to balance the presentation and the discussion time. And again, if we are picking up some very interesting and relevant questions, we try to come back to that later, perhaps tomorrow morning or in the course of later today. So let me then move to the next slide. Hold on a second. And now I try to not to make a mistake. Hold on, I just don't see my. Is it visible? Are we on? Do you see number 4?
Not yet. It's not
on the screen. Hold on. It's somehow on my screen. Hold on, because for me it's completely visible, so I see it as a presentation, but hold on, let me end the slideshow and then I try to come back to it.
Shall I share in the meanwhile?
Just one second. So this is revenue. Just a second. So this is number 4. So I share the screen. Probably I'm just too impatient and clicking too fast on the presentation button, so it's not coming up. Yes, can you see it now? Yeah, again. I wish climate change mitigation was as easy as handling those slides. So I think this is the moment for moving from the painful but necessary theory and this sort of overall background in which hopefully I provided a handful of practical examples, on the ground experiences, to, I think, to the key interest of most of you, of those mechanisms established under the UNFCCC, spanning from the Kyoto Protocol, dating back to 1997, and then being operationalized in the last 2 decades, to the Paris Agreement and the new methods and the new market mechanisms of Article 6, as well as going and looking out all those voluntary setups and markets which are outside of the Paris Agreement, whilst obviously completely interlinked with it, due to the fact that the very same interventions can fall under both, and whatever happens is likely to be captured by an NDC, a nationally determined contribution, which is now the most fundamental element of the Paris Agreement. So from this and from now on until the end of the Friday session, we will really be talking about this pretty much program or project-based interventions, what I think we all describe as offsets. And we will have a little bit of a historic overview, which also ensures that what I referred to in my question answer, that we have learned so much what we should not unlearn or forget, and obviously that includes a large number of problems what we are now trying to address, and that's also the way how one can actually see Article 6 of the Paris Agreement as the next step from the Kyoto world. This presentation will really focus on the UNFCCC, and then we would move to the voluntary carbon markets, and we will also explore how they are inherently interlinked with each other. So the learning objectives for today is rather simple. We will really dance around offsets and international cooperation under this under the Kyoto and the Paris Agreement, with a particular focus on the flexible mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And on Article 6 we will go into more detail. We really want to understand what are offsets, what their life cycle is, how they work, how they should work, how they have actually worked, what are the lessons, what we learned from the Kyoto Protocol, and get a slightly better understanding of that historic journey. What are the things which have changed? What are the things which have remained the same? What are the lessons what we still need to carry with ourselves? So let's just start this session with a quick question, and this will be number 16, on what are the international carbon mechanisms, what we already know. And again, my expectation is that we will have an extremely full workload. So could you just please go to question number 16 in AHA slides. Do check whether this is the same number, but I hope it will be. Yes, and we are already getting the message, how a rather complex picture have emerged over the last 20 years. I see the Chicago Carbon Exchange as one of the historic ones turning up on the screen, and obviously CDM appears to be dominating history, and obviously from your perspective it's absolutely very clear. I'm very happy to see joint implementation, on which I was working as an architect and as an implementer. This is the developed country version of CDM, and it has huge implications for Article 6, because in my view, we are really moving into a joint implementation world where everyone has targets, has NDCs. So a lot of lessons what were learned within the developed or within the OECD countries within the Kyoto Protocol are extremely relevant for our future. I also see green bonds coming up. Again, as I talked about green certificates, green bonds will be an extremely important mechanism to actually finance whatever we do. So they would probably be the way to actually raise the funding for those projects which would fall under Article 6. So the financing means and the actual carbon market machinery would come. I think, how can I put it? This is really the way how I also see the world, and obviously from the Southeast Asian perspective, GCM, the Japanese crediting mechanism, also plays an extremely important role of promoting a technology transfer. So I probably should say that this is not a surprise to me. And hopefully this is not a surprise to you either. Again, seeing the gold standard turning up as one of the key and long-standing, very, very high quality player, really representing continuity between the Kyoto world and the Article 6 world and the actual broader sustainability impact vehicles world is just giving me some very, very positive feelings. So let me just take back the screen. And again, apologies for this tedious move between the screens. Yesterday, I think we were somehow better off it, but now, or no, so I think we are not bad at it, but it's somehow slow. So what you have put up in a very elegant way is really falling into a broader context. And I think, let me just recall that context. When we have, and this is again, we should not forget it, we will focus on the carbon markets, but this is really falling into a bigger picture, within which obviously carbon pricing is the broader field. You know, taxation is really something what you are not bothered if you are in a particular carbon market project developer seat, or if you want to implement something in your country, in your municipality, in your region. But then obviously we have, especially from the UNFCCC perspective, we have other angles on climate finance, on technology transfer, ensuring that innovations from the developed to the entire world are actually spreading. Obviously, we have adaptation and resilience, capacity building for all climate action, including all the subjects what we are talking about, regulators, and the loss and damage mechanism, which is, I think, now becoming a more and more hot subject as we face irreversible damage by climate change. So what we really need to understand that as carbon pricing is part of the climate action machinery, carbon markets, and especially the instruments what we have under the Kyoto Protocol or under Article 6 are just part of the game. If they are designed in the right way, then they foster co-benefits and are linked to all these other things, and they would definitely drive reductions. Any of those elements what you see here are inherently linked to carbon markets. You name technology transfer, and then you realize that through these markets, technology transfer is accelerated. Adaptation and co-benefits on adaptation and resilience are always need to be kept in mind, even if you design a mitigation project. Capacity building, making your government aware of these things, making them able to actually work on this are all issues what are inherently interlinked. So when it comes the carbon markets, then you really need to come up with, again, for conceptualizing them, a typology. You asked why they exist. Is it something which is driven by regulation, so it's a mandatory compliance market, or is it voluntary? It is where the players, including and mostly businesses, are coming together voluntarily to actually do something good for the climate or for the environment. Then you ask the question, which is very related: who drives the demand? You know, markets without a demand are not really markets, and this is something which we will be coming back on Article 6. Is it governments? Is it the UNFCCC? Is it an international agreement? Or is it actually individuals or private entities who create the demand? And obviously, whether the scale is global or domestic, on which if you have international buyers, then by definition, you could have an international market. And if your drivers are predominantly domestic, then you have a domestic market. And through that, you could actually paint a rather simple picture, asking these questions on the whys and on the wheres. You would then come up with this little screen where emission trading systems at the moment happen to be rather domestic compliance market, but you can obviously connect these emission trading systems predominantly at the moment domestic ones, making them international. In this respect, the EU emission trading system is already international. It happens between EU member states who have actually very different emission features. Then obviously you could have very international markets with compliance features, and that is the international aviation offsetting market, which is by definition international. It covers international flights. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, it then becomes an international market in emission reductions. And then you would have angles on personal offsetting or corporate social responsibility, where you do have voluntary actions, again, both on the domestic or linked to the domestic or to the international levels. So this is something which is rather dynamic, and again, as we talked about the increase of the overall scale and size of carbon markets, we could expect that internalization is always going to take place, whether it's voluntary or it's compliance. And with the demands of the Paris Agreement requiring everyone to act, implying that compliance markets would most probably be taking over the overall emissions. So my view on this is that if we have such a discussion in 5 years' time, really everything will be put into the top right corner, because everything will be interconnected all around the world through linked compliance markets, and by definition, in order to reach their efficiency and delivering the highest emission reductions for the same amount of investment, they will become international. But see you in 5 years' time, and then we will be able to look at that. But that's already the trend. So if we ask the question, and again looking at the present, and then we will look back at the past later on, when it comes to the ecosystem of the international carbon markets after the Glasgow COP, we do have an emerging picture in which Article 6 falls under the international, the UNFCCC regulated programs. We have an increasing and always increasing voluntary and independent offset programs. And we do have the national schemes, which are obviously sometimes even subnational or non-federal, which are operating. And for that, there is increasing international guidance and rules, which are affecting all of them. And obviously, we still have two large groups of buyers. We have voluntary buyers, but what we have seen for the last 15 years, always in an increasing way, as climate has become more and more pressing and more personal, or personal for corporations. And we do have, through the introduction of various and numerous compliance mandatory systems, we do have compliance bias. So I have brought up a few examples, which I think I will at this moment really skip, and we will come back to the nitty-gritty and to the details of that, on how particular projects over time evolved, even from CDM to impacts. For far broader impacts, obviously, with coke stoves, the health impacts are far bigger than the climate impacts, and far more beneficial, actually following the evolving rules over time. So just again summarizing what offsets are, we have run this little screen yesterday, but I just want to bring it up. As soon as you have a system which demands, either mandatorily or in a voluntary manner, that entities meet particular emission targets, meeting these emission targets can be allowed through offsets. The importance is really, it's a design decision. If you have a system in which you limit emissions for particular players, obviously normally businesses or emitters, you can design that system allowing or not allowing offsets entering. You can even design your tax systems, offsets being used to fulfill your obligations. And this then generates the flow or the lack of the flow of offsets, and it creates the demand. And that's again the key issue. Unless you have systems which are generating demands for offsets, offsets are just imaginary. You can only generate an offset if there is someone who is interested in that. Again, basic nature of markets. So just looking at the way how offsets are generated, things are getting pretty complicated as compared to emission trading and as compared to carbon taxation. Question why? The reason is that offsets or carbon credits, if you use the name which was coined back in the late 90s by my esteemed Dutch colleagues, whom I then was lucky enough to work with in the carbon credits.nl program, the first emission reduction operationalization of the Kyoto Protocol done by the Dutch government and at the same time by the Prototype Carbon Fund of the World Bank, really relies on art as opposed to the science, so to say, of allowances and carbon taxes. And the reason for that is that when it comes to offsets, the way how they are calculated is based on a baseline, which is by definition counterfactual. We are trying to establish what would have happened in the absence of that particular offset project. And that is by definition not known. You are really trying to figure out what would be the emissions if you are not implementing the project. But you are implementing the project, so you would only know what the emissions with the project, with the program, no matter how small, how big it is coming up with. So of course, you have some issues how to measure project emissions. Figuring out what a particular improved efficiency coke stove or a different fuel coke stove emits is not that easy. But what is far more difficult is establishing what would have happened in the absence of the project, which is by definition counterfactual. It doesn't happen because you are replacing that imagined reality with the project. And this is, to me, the most fundamental issue of offsets. We have created a system, which again, we are very fond of, and we have learned a lot about it, which resembles art, which is by definition subjective, as opposed to the ideas behind emission trading, when you measure what is being emitted and you don't think about what is not being emitted. You don't think about how, in another manner, a power plant or a cement manufacturing facility would operate. You are only interested in what is being emitted, what is coming out of the chimney. And with the offsets, you are not only interested in what is coming out of the chimney, which sometimes is not easy. A chimney of a small hut of a rural family with a cook stove is definitely not easy to measure what they burn, how they burn it, and so on. But the more fundamental challenge is really the issue how you set your baselines. And I think because of our planning, let me suggest that with this screen, which we may even leave on the screen with the counter, we have now a 10 minutes break, and then we come back and we continue this presentation at 3:08. Would that be okay?
Yes.
Okay, so then, and yeah, if we can really leave this on the screen, because to me this is the most mind-boggling issue with respect to offsets. And if you have not been troubled with it, then I really would like you to stare at this and think about, how you personally, when you work on a project, it would establish that particular baseline, which actually defines the volume of offsets and volume of credits. But yeah, I stop talking and we reconvene in 10 minutes.
Zot, you're on mute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's very difficult to continue if I am muted, no matter how enthusiastic I am. So welcome back. And then I hope that this little screen, which might have, which have caused a lot of trouble for me in my life, is something which we will be able to address as we move ahead. Hold on again. So again, I have thrown in the offsets. I have shown some visuals, but then let us just recall what those offsets are, what we are really talking about, what those project-based credits, what we will be talking about in the course of the coming 2 days. So the idea is that you can imagine 1 ton equivalent of a certificate, so to say, which can be very widely used on compliance markets, be domestic or international, or it can be used in voluntary markets. And then obviously they can do a lot of things in terms of bringing an entity to compliance, in terms of generating international climate finance, in terms of reducing the domestic compliance costs, and obviously it could also be something which would go and incentivize actions in those areas which are themselves are not covered by obligatory mandatory emission reductions. And in this respect, you really need to look at these different features depending on what your role are. Because if you are a financier, then you would really see it as a new vehicle for financing. Again, we mentioned green bonds as the potential way of raising funding, which then can be used going into climate change mitigation projects through the purchasing of offsets, for example. If you are sitting with a regulatory hat, you would see these offsets as a particular means of contributing to the regulatory roles of the compliance regime, what you are managing. And then, depending on your choice, you allow particular offsets and you may not allow other offsets. If you are in the aviation sector and you want to reduce the aviation's emissions, and then you realize that sustainable aviation fuels are a long way to go, then you consider that, well, why don't we include offsets in the aviation sector, and so on. So it's really, again, you have different features or different faces of these offsets, what you need to look at all the time. Then looking at it from the perspective of how an offset is generated and how it's being used, and then how it's actually even disappears after being used up as any other product. And this is really the angle where, from the Kyoto perspective or from the Paris perspective, we would learn the most on how to operationalize them. And on that, I just let me introduce a very sort of simplified semantics, which starts with designing the program, the project, the actual intervention, which on the ground in your particular community reduces the emissions. Coming up with its design, then you need to validate it. Someone who is external, who is normally an auditor, really need to say that, yes, indeed, this is in line with that particular expectation defined by a system. And that system can be national, can be international, can be the UNFCCC, can be the Article 6 mechanism. Then, if and when such audit occurs on that program design, then you can actually register that project with the system which owns the rules, which is the player who defines those particular carbon market requirements, what you are meeting with your design. As soon as that registration, that acceptance of that project, by that whatever mechanism happens, then you implement your project. but then obviously you also monitor to ensure that those climate impacts, what you have envisaged, those emission reductions occur. Then again, you ask an external auditor who would look at it and who would say that indeed, this is all in line what you designed, what is required by that register system according to you are working with. And then based on that verification of a particular period, the activities on that particular period, then these offsets are being issued by that system for which you are registered. And then obviously this happens on a regular basis because on annually or in whatever your regulatory circle for monitoring, you do that and then you do have those offsets in your hands. And then as soon as you have those offsets in your hands, you can actually sell them. And then they have their own life. Multiple players can sell and resell them or even cancel them, saying that, yes, this particular offsets actually stands against my own emissions, perhaps on a different continent, coming from a completely different activity. And then you sit back and you say, I have created a carbon offset. I have really designed and implemented a system which generates genuine third-party verifiable emission reductions, and those emission reductions would actually help someone somewhere to claim that they are carbon neutral or they are reducing their contributions to climate change by purchasing and through the purchasing financing that particular activity. So it's not a simple life cycle, isn't it? It's really something which goes back and which I guess is absolutely necessitated by that counterfactual nature of the carbon credits. The more complex the initial design and the more complex the actual concept with relying on counterfactual baselines and actual emissions and the comparison of the two, the more complex the life cycle of offset generation becomes. But that's really not something which should hold you back. It then obviously shows that all these stages would really require different players. So this is really a game with various players who are supposedly working smoothly together. Again, since we have done this in the Kyoto period, I expect that we have learned a lot how to deal with these systems. The voluntary carbon market has been around also for a long time. Its players have also learned how to deal with that. And for each specialized role, professional entities have emerged over time. In this respect, let me mention that as a member of VERICO, we are the first EU cooperative on doing such a thing for the EU emission trading system. But not surprisingly, all of us came from the CDM world, from doing CDM and JI projects in parallel to our ETS work. So obviously we have the experience in all these particular fields. And that's really the point where, again, with this yellow exclamation mark, I should really remind ourselves that offsets are really tough, because obviously due to all these considerations about counterfactuality, about the requirements to be environmental, not to violate environmental integrity, to look at all direct and indirect impacts of offsets, we really, over the years of the Kyoto Protocol, came up with a large number of requirements what good offsets are to be met. Obviously, in that, we would have additionality, really ensuring that without the project activity, without the very climate activity that you are claiming, that thing would have not taken place. And that's not something which is easy to prove, because again, you really need to come forward and face that counterfactuality of your project and argue strongly that without the funding, without some other interventions that is brought in by the project, that project would have not taken place. Obviously, we have the quantification challenge, how to measure and that was again the question on what happens with household level emissions. How do you measure emissions in a credible, but at the same time cost-effective manner? How those emission reductions are sustained over time. This is where all land-based interventions, including forestry, afforestation and reforestation, comes up as a big question marks. What happens if a forest which you actually cultivate and improve with great care and great work actually burns down? And it burns down because of extreme weather events which are exacerbated by climate change. What happens if your emission reductions is not permanent? So this obviously leads to those challenges on baseline methodologies and monitoring methodologies. But the good news, we are not at the beginning. We are not back in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol came up with these great ideas of the flexible mechanism. We are 24, 5 years later with a large number of lessons learned and very detailed prescribed baseline methodologies and monitoring methodologies, what are in the hands of the UNFCCC, and which will be sort of inherited and will be used by the new mechanisms established under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. And obviously voluntary market players have borrowed from these rules. Sometimes they have overwritten it, sometimes they even added fields which were not covered by existing CDM methodologies. So there is a huge volume of knowledge out there which we can build on, but obviously we should not forget that we have also key lessons and pitfalls what we have faced in the past. So again, looking at history, and I think that's, instead of looking backwards with nostalgia, let me try to do that without the nostalgic feeling, just to sort of factually recall how it happened and why we had the little gap, well, the not so little gap after 2012. So recalling the first global agreement under the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol dating back to 1997, where the agreement came that let's initiate and support international action and international cooperation on climate change. Again, driven by the fact that it's no matter where we reduce emissions from the global perspective, it counts. 1 ton, no matter where it is emitted or where it is not emitted, it makes no difference from a global perspective. Therefore, let's come up with a system which allows transfers of technologies, transfers of funding from the developed world to the developing world, where it was assumed that pressing needs for emission reductions and opportunities for emission reductions existed at lower cost. The whole idea was that for the compliance under the convention to reduce emissions, which was only quantified at around 8% reduction for the developed world, could actually be achieved partly by taking action in developing countries. And this would have then, the thinking would accelerate the implementation and the achievement of those goals set for the so-called first compliance period of 2008 and 2012 globally. This obviously resulted in the idea of differentiation of a sort of bifurcation of the world, of those who had a target and those who didn't. And those who had a target could reach that target by their own domestic actions, but they could also rely on 3 market-based mechanisms in which they were able to actually include emission reductions from elsewhere. The CDM in this respect defined the developing countries as the places where project interventions could take place, and joint implementation and international emission trading actually defined the mechanisms within the developed world that they could actually achieve their targets by cooperating with each other. With joint implementation, it was on a project level. which is in this respect was very similar to the concept of the CDM, but the country grouping was different. And then with respect to international emissions trading, it was the trading of the so-called assigned amount units, which were the actual authorized amount of emissions what the developing countries individually were allowed to emit. And again, that assumed the fact that some countries may reach their targets easier or cheaper or at all, and some countries would not achieve their 2008-2012 on average 8% reduction targets. And that's proven true. There were countries who could actually achieve these targets without doing anything, so to say. Just imagine the former Soviet Union of transitional economies in 1997 were still undergoing a very strong structural change, and some of their industries were heavily and quickly disappearing, whilst their targets were based on their 1990-1991 still communist years emissions. And obviously there were other countries who have already done so much on emission reductions, or who had factors or sectors where emission reductions were not that easy, which were facing difficulties in meeting their Kyoto targets, and were eyeing on all these three international mechanisms to meet their targets in combination with their domestic action. But that was a simple word. There were people, there were countries with targets, and there were countries without targets. And then it was allowed to trade in between those two. And among those countries who had the targets, the flexibility were introduced to IET, international emission trading, and joint implementation. Let me remind ourselves that this is the word of the Paris Agreement. We all have targets, and we are all encouraged to cooperate and coordinate actions with each other. So if you look back, and obviously at that time in 1997, we had no idea which directions the international governance would work, we actually established a subset of the world, the developed countries, listed in the Annex 1 of the Kyoto Protocol, and mostly coinciding with the OECD countries, are resembling the entirety of the world under the Paris Agreement. In this respect, or from this perspective, international emission trading and joint implementation really offers the lessons for what happens if everyone within a group is covered by a quantitative target. And that quantitative target was globally agreed in case of the Kyoto Protocol. You can look it up of how many percentage points those countries under Annex 1 have to reduce their emissions. And that is now defined by the NDCs, by each country on its own individually under the Paris Agreement. But this is really an important facet and feature of the Kyoto world that is resembling today's setup. And that's why we would have a lot of lessons to carry on from, intriguingly, more from international emissions trading and joint implementation, which is more similar to the Article 6 word of the Paris Agreement than from the clean development mechanism. But obviously the clean development mechanism created all that methodological and monitoring and reporting and verification wealth and knowledge and expertise what we really need to look at the moment whenever we develop particular projects. So in this setup, the flow was very, very clear, and I already alluded to that, how developed countries could actually trade among themselves through using the mechanism of joint implementation and international emission trading, and how developing countries provided a pool of potential projects what developed countries could use for their own obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. The arrows indicate the flow of units and how they were actually, where they were generated and where they went. Obviously, the clean development mechanism has become the largest among these mechanisms. This was obviously the only global thing, because that covered the entirety of the world in terms of in terms of sources and demand, and obviously we ended up with thousands of projects and with calculated billions of emission reductions. Again, do remember that this was the period when we were between 30 to 40 or over 40 billion tons of emissions per year. So no matter how large CDM was, from a global emission perspective, the significance of CDM in terms of delivering emission reductions could be questioned. And if you recall my little and heavily increasing slope showing the emissions of the world, with dense at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the global economic crisis of 2008 and 9, and at the pandemic. You would recall that when the Kyoto Protocol got institutionalized, I didn't show any sort of sharp decline in emissions. And the very reason for that these are marginal in terms of the volumes. But obviously the CDM is not marginal in terms of the way how we actually learned to design and run all these mechanisms, how we came up with the methodologies, how we actually initiated technology transfers, which would have happened or would have happened far later in those cases. And that's why it's really, really important to acknowledge that CDM as a tool is really, really valuable. And whatever we do now should build on what we have learned. And that obviously those lessons also includes the mistakes, what we should not be repeating in the future. And obviously with the COP26 agreements, the transitioning and the sort of bringing forward and providing the continuity for CDM under the Paris Agreement, and especially under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, creating a mechanism really resembling CDM is something what is of key importance, and why we should really remember all these lessons. There are just a few statistics on showing how obviously you in Southeast Asia ended up with the largest chunk of projects. Obviously, this is a global presentation, so there are a few slides on issues showing prevalence of CDM across the globe. So just a very, very quick recap of the positive and the controversial heritage. The controversial are positive in a sense that we could learn from it, so we can overcome these barriers. So even the negatives to be seen as encouragements to actually overcome difficulties and barriers. On the positive side, obviously it brought sustainable development benefits, but I think one should really be mentioning that the broader sustainability view, the trade-offs, look at biodiversity, look at the use of bioenergy use or impact of bioenergy use on air quality, were not fully understood. Obviously by now we know a lot more, and the SDGs are really, really helpful to put all these things into context. Obviously, mobilize the private sector for climate action. This is something which we should not be overlooking. The private sector, businesses, unless there is a market mechanism, would not join forces. You need to create a market in order to engage businesses, and this has been taken place. Obviously, the flexibility and the cost reduction, therefore the encouragement of increased action, is something which was absolutely essential. This was also a mechanism which want to make a major engagement by private players in a completely new field. And for that, obviously a mechanism which allowed them to make profits, which spoke in their own language, money, was absolutely essential. And then, as I mentioned multiple times, the guidelines, the methodologies, the entire machinery of the CDM is really something which is extremely valuable. On the negative side, on the elements where we must improve, and that's why I call them challenges, this is really something where many argue that the actual overall emission reductions or the leakages, so actually emissions occurring somewhere else, not in the project, but somewhere else actually triggered by the project, has been seen as a major factor. Obviously, there was the geographical imbalance in coverage, and obviously where Southeast Asia obviously scored very high, but some places, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, really lagged behind and couldn't benefit. Obviously now there are, partly because of this, there are new mechanisms or even new support is created for the least developed countries, and in this respect, we should expect that these lessons are reflected when it comes to the Article 6 agreements. And obviously we ended up with a rather complex regulation, which obviously, if we are talking about a complex issue, is not surprising. If we are talking about the arty nature of baseline and credit schemes, that's also not surprising either. These mechanisms are by definition far more complex than an emission trading system or a carbon tax because of the inherent choice of how they are defining a ton of avoided carbon as opposed to a ton of emitted carbon in case of taxation and in case of an emission trading scheme. So a little bit on joint implementation, which is close to my heart, whilst obviously it might just be unknown to you, because obviously in your part of the world, JI was not operating. The reason why I really need to talk about it, because it so much resembles the present situation. JI was happening among those countries under the Annex 1 of the Kyoto Protocol who all committed to particular emission reductions. And still committing to particular emission reductions, they had completely different technical, technological, and financing structures. Obviously, in the former communist bloc, there had been an extreme amount of extremely obsolete, highly polluting plans, which could go under change by benefiting from joint implementation. There were things which could be converted, obviously at a cost, or could be closed. Joint implementation really offered an opportunity for that. And again, over time, and that was also part of the flexibility of the design, it also allowed to create different rules among different countries, agreeing bilaterally on the particular ways of how they traded the emission reductions. Again, this is something that we are now reinventing in Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, encouraging countries to sit down and talk to each other and agree on these ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation options. This is JI. I mean, it's called differently, but this is what happened in the past. And this was really the time when countries were looking at each other, figuring out how they cooperate. And we will look at tomorrow the Article 6 pilot projects where countries are looking and working with each other, exactly establishing the same on bilateral level. Obviously in JI, there were two tracks. One was with a heavy oversight by the UNFCCC, actually very similar to the CDM, in which the JI Supervisory Committee authorized the projects. But then there was a simplified procedure in which countries could actually agree with each other and even act in a way which was rather similar to what was envisaged under the international emission trading system, in which not projects, but actual assigned amount units were traded or exchanged between countries. Obviously, JI, in the same way as CDM, come to a dead end at the end of 2012 in the absence of the second commitment Kyoto period ratification. But the relevant lessons which we learned in that period running up to 2012 would be absolutely essential for Article 6, because this is extremely similar to the global setup in which NDCs define the limits for all countries, their self-assigned limits, as opposed to the Kyoto Protocol assigned limits for emissions, and then allows countries to cooperate with each other. And then you would look at that little chart showing the number of the JI projects, which also resembles the volumes, obviously, former Soviet Union, Ukraine and Russia taking the lion's share of projects, again, due to their features. But I worked on a project between the Netherlands and New Zealand on green electricity. And that project worked until the point when the New Zealanders discovered that they have far more emissions from their sheep than they thought. So they felt that they would have a surplus, they would have easy ways of reducing emissions. Therefore, they were willing to cooperate with the Netherlands, which was already very short and felt it very difficult to meet its Kyoto target. And therefore, green electricity wind farm projects were contracted between the two countries, and was an initial success of JI. And then all of a sudden, New Zealand discovered that it will face major difficulties in meeting its Kyoto commitments. So it would stop, and it should stop, selling emission reductions to another country, because it will have difficulties meeting its own commitments. This is really the question what every country under the Paris Agreement at the moment faces. Hold on, what should I do? Should I sell or should I keep it? Or should I establish some sort of cooperation which would help me to reach my targets, and which would allow the other country meeting its targets, perhaps by splitting these things? With Slovakia and with Romania, I was the negotiator on behalf of the Netherlands on coming up with such a scheme in which half of emission reductions coming from landfills in these two countries, landfill gas capturing projects, were remaining with the country, and the other half of generated by Dutch investments were taken to the Netherlands. And then everyone felt happy. Again, I don't want to simplify, and obviously these negotiation processes were really, really tough with countries who were joining the EU and who were facing more and more stringent emission reductions and environmental regulations. But these are the things which I expect to happen, to take place now. So what happened with JI 15, almost 20 years ago within the OECD is something that we will be seeing on a global scale. And that's why I really suggest that you get familiar with joint implementation, because as soon as you really start discussing Article 6.2 projects with countries who might be very similar to those who were interested in CDM and JI at the first place 20 years ago, you will run into questions which we have faced and we have answered one way or another 20 years ago. So with international emission trading, that's something where the relevance might be less direct for the new system, because obviously international emission trading could only take place if you have an assigned amount of emissions, and which happened under Kyoto, where countries really had a particular volume which they had to meet, and obviously they were allowed to trade. If they emitted less their emission cap, they can sell, and if they emitted more, then they were obliged to buy. Again, we will see what emerges under the Paris Agreement, how countries would interpret their own set ceilings and emission caps, and how they may end up doing similar transfers what happened under international emission trading, in which I guess the key lesson was that AAUs were never traded unless some explanations were given on how these amounts were generated, and the amount which was paid was most of the time earmarked in order to ensure some sort of credibility and environmental integrity or the use of these funds for climate action. Again, this is a lesson, and there were also arguments why and how those who were trying to sell these AAUs already claimed that they have done their own climate actions in the past. Their society have already paid the cost of industrial transformations, of collapsing of old, heavily polluting industries, and so on. Again, discussions which I would be expecting to come up under 6.2 of the Paris Agreement in the future. So yeah, the bilateral country-to-country cooperation and deals and transactions, there will be relevant lessons. And again, someone who dives back to history and looks at how the Japanese and the Ukrainians have struggled to agree, and then how they agreed, and then how they went to court fighting each other with a particular deal on international emission trading and AAU transfers, would find very useful insights on how this works and what are the pitfalls. So the long journey from Kyoto to Paris already partly covered, and therefore I really would like to ask a question. And asking our colleagues to open up question 17, asking what aspects of the Paris Agreement set up is different from the Kyoto Protocol, on which I guess if you listen to me, then I think you would have some hints. And if you are already an expert in this field, then obviously you should really be able to put down your thoughts, the keywords of the Paris Agreements, which are really different in the Paris Agreement. And this will again be in the shape of a word cloud, with the view that we will really see the novel elements, the different element of the Paris Agreement coming up as compared to the past, what I have been describing with so much nostalgia. So as our colleagues are seeing the results and to some way the results developing on the word cloud, then I ask them to share the screen, and then we will see how different you see the Paris Agreement with its different infrastructure for carbon markets as compared to the Kyoto Protocol.
So the results are coming up on the screen now.
Yes, and I keep fingers crossed that NDCs would stay in the center, and they did. And this is really, to me, the key message, again, on how competent audience we are. So, it's really the appreciation of understanding of these inherently complicated systems, what we have created for tackling climate change, really shared between us. Because to me, if I'm asked what is the single difference between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol, then really the answer is the NDCs, because obviously the NDCs captures the inherent difference. In the Kyoto Protocol, we really have the top-down agreement on who needs to achieve what, and then we throw in a few instruments to help that. With the Paris Agreement, we really take that upside down, and it's become a bottom-up approach in order to engage all, and that's the NDCs. And I guess when it comes to the overall acceptance of our common, shared but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities, the NDCs are really, really the right answer. If we look at it from our carbon market, from our Article 6 perspective, this is also the most critical complexity what we need to address. And obviously, when it comes to all the other words and elements in that word cloud, we really see all these difficulties, all those angles, what we really need to be looking at. But that's the point where NDCs and Article 6 is going to be, I think, a tough challenge, because it's different conceptually from the way how we looked at in the past. And obviously in a world which is characterized by all of us having targets, which we set on our own, it would make it inherently difficult and challenging, still doable and absolutely necessary to actually figure out how we structure international cooperation. And that's also the point where, if we look at the ways how the Kyoto Protocol actually triggered, facilitated international action, how it actually helped to come up with all those details, with all those modalities, with all those skills, including the people having those skills to do more on climate, then we would really see Article 6 as the machinery for creating the similar momentum, the similar scaling and speeding up of climate action on the global scale. And that's why I'm just so glad to see that you put your finger on the right answer on how and why the Kyoto Protocol, the old architecture under the UNFCCC for market mechanisms, and the new architecture with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and its overall NDC-driven nature are different from each other. So thank you very much, and I'm really, really happy to see that yeah, we are in the same boat and we are seeing the challenges in the same way. So let me just go back and share my own screen. Hold on. Can you see my slide? Because now it's not moving on my screen. Hold on. Yes. Now the lovely 1.5 degree picture is visible on your screen, is it?
Yes.
Okay. So then I guess the very well-known photos of 2015, the celebration of the sleepless nights in Paris. And then again, as I told you, with the NDCs, we now have a setup in which all countries have mitigation goals. We do have the country-driven NDCs at the core of the Paris Agreement. We also have that long-term view and the increasing number of long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies and net zero targets are flowing in. So we do have, particular dates by an increasing number of countries actually saying what the end goal is and by when that carbon neutrality will be achieved. Obviously, what we have as plans and as self-established obligations or pledges is still sadly far away from the Paris Agreement objectives of well below 2 and the aspirational 1.5. Again, we have done a lot of improvements. And again, let me just reflect on what happened in 6 years since Paris, and then what happened in a few weeks before and during COP26. Again, clearly demonstrating that if we have NDCs and if we have competing and cooperating countries who are not want to be left behind, who don't want to be seen as climate laggards, who actually want to lead, then we do improve ambition. Again, this is a bit of an exaggeration, of course, because those things and those pledges and those commitments which were announced before and around COP26 have been in the making for a long period of time. But on the left-hand side, I show the amount of improvements of 5 years. There was the constant call. We understood in Paris that it's not enough. Obviously, Paris was designed in a way that built-in ambition increase was part of it. It's the review cycle, it's the GTC, it's really the way how the Paris agreement is designed, with the global stock takes, with this sort of let's return regularly and improve our ambitions. But that request has resulted in very, very minimal improvements before COP26. Obviously, it had some improvements, but not that much. And if you look at on the right-hand side, you would see that far more, almost triple the time, actually came up in the course on the pledges at COP26. It also clearly shows that it's not only countries any longer who are standing up for climate action, but it's everyone. It's corporations, it's the finance sector, it's really all societal stakeholders are coming forward with their own commitments, with their own actions for accelerating climate change. This is better, but obviously this is still not good enough for achieving 1.5. But if you consider that an agreement which built in ambition increase as a mechanism, which then resulted in this level of ambition increase over 6 years, could have features which are far more encouraging in the long term than the Kyoto Protocol, which came up with a particular set level of ambition as a negotiated outcome for a relatively small and over time shrinking part of the world, without the inbuilt mechanism to actually increase ambition. And this is something what we really need to remember as and when we are facing those difficulties and challenges which are created for Article 6 by the very nature of the MDCs. So the slide which I think I brought in my introduction of showing how and when we influence global emissions, and helping statistics to analyze the reasons why emissions are decreasing. And this is really the sad lesson, showing that until now, on our Kyoto to Paris and to COP26 journey, we have really not succeeded reducing emissions. You see that climbing, and you really see how some particular economic shocks, including the oil crisis, including the collapse of the former Soviet world, including the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, and now the pandemic cut our emissions. But certainly we must do better. And obviously that's also the whole point with the Paris Agreement of having this entire machinery placed on a global scale. It's a global game in which we must globally reduce these emissions. And it's really striking that, again, it took us 6 years since Paris to actually figure out the rules with a major contributing angle. Article 6, market and non-market mechanism, could help this process. But again, don't forget that corporations, the voluntary market, the greening of the financial system, or financing green, are all moving in the same direction. And hopefully we would face that steep slope towards net zero as we move ahead in this year. So again, the historic perspective really offers these very stark differences. in the Kyoto mechanism, flexibility was designed and built in only for a small set of countries to meet their mandatory targets. Whilst obviously Article 6 and the Paris Agreement really looking at globally all countries who would all be able to participate in this mechanism, and then it is really designed in a way that it could increase the ambition of all countries of the world. Obviously, the framing around sustainable development and environmental integrity is even stronger than in the past. So we are completely global with the Paris Agreement, and we are really looking at and incorporating all necessary features associated with sustainable development, including the trade-offs and including those interconnections. So in this respect, the journey has resulted in Article 6.2, which is cooperative approaches, basically allowing countries to cooperate with each other. And again, this is something that I described as with international emission trading and JI within the Kyoto world among the developed countries. This is obviously something where the Track 1 JI ideas of countries being allowed to agree with each other is really the principle. Under Article 6.2, the authority really belongs to the parties. There will be some guidance, and obviously, if completely silly agreements are being made, then certainly the UNFCCC as an oversight body of the Paris Agreement, parties to the Paris Agreement, would certainly raise their fingers. But in principle, it's the parties who will be doing this, obviously should be following particular guidance on providing information, providing transparency, which they are actually required to do anyway on their climate actions and on their emissions. Article 6.4 can really be seen as the daughter or the son of CDM. This is a crediting mechanism with oversight of the UNFCCC, with a supervisory body for which appointments are being made, although those appointments are apparently very delayed. So the operationalization of that body might be again suffering some further delays. But this is something which is by and large, and many people use the term temporarily, that this is the sustainable development mechanism of the UNFCCC, again, including broader development goals, but obviously focusing on climate. Again, the big difference, this is open to all. It is really a global mechanism in which the entities who would participate would be completely global, and there are no differentiation. It's no matter whether you are in the richest country of the world, you could still be a seller of a project, and in a least developed country, you could actually be a buyer of a project, in principle. Obviously, that is not going to happen, but certainly there are no differentiation. This Article 6.4 applies to the whole world. Again, I think LDCs might have some particular treatments as time evolve in terms of the rules. But again, that will be something decided by under the authority of the UNFCCC. And then we have Article 6.8, non-market approaches, which could really accommodate all innovative ideas on doing sustainable development related work, perhaps putting a large number of official development aid projects with particular climate features under it. It's really something which, in my view, is a major placeholder for innovations yet to be seen, which are not monetized and which are not developed through the markets, for which obviously Article 6.2 and 6.4 would allow to be the mechanism. It's also something yet to be seen how Article 6.2 would include possibly some non-market approaches, perhaps activities which would at the end would not end up with internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So countries who would invest, who would support others, may not claim any credit for those emission reductions. They may just do the calculations and the quantification of those emission reductions. But one may argue that if such happens, then that automatically falls under Article 6.8, because if there is no transaction, so to say, associated with emission reductions, then you are not talking about international transferred mitigation outcomes, because the outcomes will not be transferred. So we have that. Finally, again, after a lot of trouble, we came up with this system. And then, yeah, I'm just adding those slides on similarities. Again, these are the issues which I really don't need to recall, because you appear to be as much of an expert of NDCs and the Paris Agreement as myself. But it's always good to be a reminder that we all have targets. We all need to achieve our own NDCs. We need to constantly increase our ambition, and obviously we can do that through engagement in these mechanisms. And therefore, we are in a situation where each and every country really need to say and decide what they intend to do, how they are going to participate in these mechanisms, if at all they participate in these mechanisms. You may say that you are proud, you are good, you will do everything yourself. And again, I would argue that some countries, especially the super rich ones, should reach their targets on their own, and then they should obviously go out to help and support others, but not with the view that instead of domestic action, they would take low-hanging fruits from somewhere else. So this is really an ongoing debate, and because the Paris Agreement is ratified by and signed by all of us, and we are all setting our own NDCs accordingly, this is a task on a global scale. So the key takeaways from this session, I think, are relatively simple, that we should not really forget all the things what we have learned from those many forms of international carbon markets in the past. We really need to build on those. There is, when it comes to the Paris Agreement, there is very explicit continuity, links between the past, the transition of the CDM into the SDM Article 6.4. We really need to look at the past with an extremely critical eye, showing the potential of these mechanisms, but also remembering the challenges. And obviously, in this respect, the lessons from JI and international emission trading are far more telling for the overall setup than from CDM. But obviously from CDM, the methodologies, what we have used, the project level actions, the project level skills and knowledge and expertise, what has been developed and has not been lost, is really something what we need to carry over. With this, I would like to hand back to Kavita and her team to raise and to share the questions which just came in during this session.
Thanks, Zot, for this extensive session. We do have, in fact, a couple of questions. Number one being, can one carbon market design include both cap and trade and baseline systems?
Thanks, Zad. It sounds very complex, but this is, I think, something which I think I try to explain by referring to the fact that both tax systems and relevant system, permit systems, emission trading systems could open up a window to offsets. And this is the exact thing what happened with CDM. CDM existed, and I explained how it came to life and so on. But the demand, without which it would have been stayed on paper, came from the European Union emission trading system. Within the ETS, the window was wide open until the last day of 2012 for including CDM credits. CERs were equivalent to an EU allowance when it came to an installation. They could decide whether they would buy a permit or they would engage in a CDM transaction with a CDM project. And that was the things which made CDM reality. The EU ETS was the single largest and most important driver, the actual force for market demand for CDM credits. And this is absolutely essential. We can come up with wonderful schemes. And to me, this is now a major challenge with Article 6. If we don't have systems which are accepting that as a valid currency, then we would have all the paperwork, we would have all the necessary ingredients, we would have the governance, you know, the new, not CDM, but Article 6.4 Executive Board to make and approve projects. But if no one wants to buy those projects through those either compliance or voluntary systems, which would take those things as an approved and valid currency, then we would be facing a huge problem. And at the moment, I must admit that I'm yet to see that vast volume from for Article 6.4 credits and project generated credits, which would make Article 6.4 a reality.
Thanks. There are some questions which are very long and complicated.
I cannot even see them because, you know, I only see half of the sentence, so I don't even try. I think these will be the ones which we will be reflecting tomorrow morning, you know, because I see, you know. But no, well, let me try to address this question, because from the very start, how does Article 6 impact voluntary market projects? This is really something which we will be talking about with the famous adjustments. How anything which a country does or how a project should be then reflected on its NDC, and this really comes down to the corresponding adjustments. Again, a really painful technical term on how anything which is authorized by a country, irrespective where it will be ending up, should be reflected in the NDC. And this is really the issue which I think is core to this question, that in a system design, which is now, I think, coming out from Glasgow, the principle, which again is very valid and very valuable, of not allowing double counting or double claiming of a particular emissions, really implies that anything which is transferred should attract this corresponding adjustment. And that basically means that I think for the longer weighted idea on you have emissions inside and outside of your NDC is no longer there. Every emission, even if it is not mentioned in your NDC, it's not included in your NDC, is seen as your national emission. So if you reduce that through a project intervention, which then you sell abroad, you have to make the corresponding adjustment. And this is really the tricky bit when a voluntary carbon market players comes in and says that I don't want to get that adjustment. I don't want to use that particular emission in my own country for a compliance purpose, but I still want to finance something good, something value added, something reducing emissions and also making other sustainable impacts. Then I would imagine, and I think this is now the general market understanding, that there will be transfers which will be marked as not carrying a corresponding adjustments, not influencing the country from where they are coming from in terms of reporting its emissions. And then at the same time saying that the corporate or the NGO or even the private buyer has contributed to sustainable development, has contributed to climate finance. And by the way, if you want to calculate the emission reductions, the impact on climate, I can give you a figure. But certainly that's not a carbon credit as we speak about it in the compliance market. Such project generated claim or explanation on the emission reductions would definitely not constitute a carbon credit, an offset. It will be called something different. It will be probably called a non-corresponding adjustment attracting contribution to climate finance. I mean, sorry for this lengthy word, but that's the way how this will be captured. And what I understand from the market players, be it the gold standard, be it Verra, is that they will go down on this differentiation route. They will be looking at carbon credits under the international regime of having the corresponding adjustment. So they will be reflected in the NDC of the country where they live. There will be a reduction of that country's reported climate action. And then at the same time, they will obviously not be used by another country to meet its own obligations. But the corporate player could claim with something which is having a CA, a corresponding adjustment, that it's actually only, it's authorized for that corporate player to claim that emission reductions, because it's not claimed by anyone else, because the country from where it is has made a corresponding adjustment. Obviously, this is going to be very tricky, and I really don't expect that too many countries would be very willing to authorize such claims. Whilst obviously there will be buyers who want to do that, but the countries would be sort of holding on to the family silver and would be very cautious making such decisions. The question is, what happens with those emission reductions projects, which again will be named differently. They will be impacts, they will be sustainable development contributions and so on, or climate finance contributions, which would not attract the corresponding adjustment. Because obviously then whatever happens in that particular country would still be taken credit by that country in terms of an emission reductions, even if it is financed completely by someone else. But then that entity who would finance it could only be proud of all the other impacts, with the exception of that quantified carbon emission. So this is really the clear example how we generated and created an international system which is inherently complicated and which also creates some perverse incentives, which also creates some rather difficult issues, including some gaming and cheating, for example, through how you calculate the emission reductions, which are going through this CA process, this corresponding adjustment, because you can do something of an averaging of a period within which you actually game the numbers and you claim more at one side than the corresponding adjustment actually reduces at the host country. So complicated, complex. I would even go to say that this is still messy because the detailed rules have not been fully established. So we claim that we have the rules, but that's in this respect, when we come down to these levels, this is sadly not the case. So we really need to agree a lot more on this, and then obviously we also have the major issues, the different issues between Article 6.2, where countries would be discussing this, and Article 6.4, where entities under the UN will be discussing this, and we would have that completely wide west of carbon credits when major corporations would knock on the door of most likely very unprepared host countries to authorize deals of particular nature, which would be perhaps very complex and very difficult to understand. So a lot more work to be done. And I think the question is certainly long, because it's such a complex issue, but we need to talk about it, and this needs to be addressed. And every country at this moment, especially who is willing to engage in these transactions, really need to come up with a lot of thinking to avoid making mistakes, which then later on cannot be unmade. Just imagine if you sign the corresponding adjustment contractual term with someone who comes in with a lot of money, with a wonderful project, what you want to do, and then in the small print, you realize that you are agreeing to 100% adjustment, corresponding adjustment of your own NDC, and that player actually runs away with the entirety of those emission reductions, which could even be far more than in reality because of methodological challenges. So yeah, you need to watch out to this, and this is going to create a lot of problems. Sorry for going into this so deeply and with so much emotion, but this is one of the crunch issues.
Thank you, Tuat. Just in relation to that, I think there's a very basic but a contentious question here, where it mentions why carbon prices are different in different countries, despite CO2 and GHG composition and impact on the environment being the same.
And again, the very answer to that, and this will be far shorter and far simpler, the carbon price is simply a function of the regulations. We are talking about the same product, the same emitted or non-emitted carbon, but the way how the price is defined, just recalling what we talked about, the emission trading systems and the carbon tax, it's really, really designed and defined by the design. If you are creating, and obviously it's also defined by demand and supply. So if you look at purely the regulations, which could be different in every single market, which could be domestic, which could be even subnational, which could be even corporate players, which could be the aviation market, CORSIA. The way how you define who is allowed to trade, what sort of requirements market players are facing, what is authorized to be a credit and what is not, defines the price. And that's really the point in coming up with a very transparent global governance on the carbon markets, on carbon. And apparently, what we are just now describing really shows that this is an extremely proliferated market. There are various players who are even claiming to have the market and saying that, well, let me set the rules, and then everyone will follow me, and then if there will be one set of rules, we will have one price eventually. But it's highly unlikely that we will have one set of rules, because countries themselves, the international community, the international business community, and so on, are all trying to set up their own rules with the resulting carbon price in that subsegment where those rules are applied. And that's the nature for something which is so artificial and which is so not globally traded yet. But then if you consider that even the Paris Agreement acceptance that countries are allowed to set their own speed and their own rules in terms of addressing climate change, that really, really signals that a global carbon market, like the oil has a carbon or global market, although with some fluctuations, or any other commodities, is really, really far away. The only thing, and again, just remember the CDM itself, the CDM as a market, which obviously was very powerful and which was almost seen as the only carbon market at a particular time, had one price. Again, there had been fluctuations on the type of the credits. There were the things which were seen very green and very positive, and there were the ones with HCFCs which were very dodgy, and where prices were different. But within CDM, we actually ended up with a single market, with a single product, so to say, CERs, which had some sort of unified pricing. At this moment, what we are seeing is that there is a large proliferation in the market. And for example, again, just using Article 6, which you may say it's the markets under Paris. But if you consider how much freedom and how much difference will have the particular parties, countries under Article 6.2 agreeing on a price, and how Article 6.4 with completely different players and different product features would evolve, I bet that the prices in Article 6.2 and 6.4 will be very different. Very simply because we are talking about pears and apples, we are talking about different players, and obviously completely different demands in all these schemes. Yeah, ideally, we would have global governments with the same rule applicable to all, and then we would have a global carbon price. But that is far, far away. And that in itself is not a problem, because with these proliferating different subsystems, with their overlaps, we can still drive effective action, provided these systems are all ambitious in terms of generating the necessary action, and in terms of generating the necessary demand to create these carbon credits and the underlying actions.
Thank you, Zot. I think we are reaching almost the end of the session for today. Zot, if you want, we can just quickly present the AHA slides on certain questions that we have, which will help us in developing the training again for the third day.
Yes, that has been the plan, and I'm glad that I have not run out of time so badly as I did yesterday. So I know that you have prepared those slides. Please go ahead with that, unless there are any pressing questions, because I still see questions are coming up. My counter shows them, but I just don't see the questions. But I think that might be best that you proceed with those slides what you have prepared, and then as we did yesterday, we will read these things, and I try to incorporate them into my opening slides and session tomorrow morning. And tomorrow morning we will not make a mistake with the wrong slide in the opening session. So yeah, I just let me hand back to you then.
Yeah, Zot, can you see that?
Yes, and obviously this is the my last questions, which I felt tempted to ask, but and with days with 18, 19, and 20, we are really looking at what went well, what went wrong, and how we improve things. So you may also find this slightly repetitive, but I just felt that capturing a few of your ideas would really be helpful. And I'm already convinced that given your demonstrated experience in these fields, you carry those useful and sometimes painful messages of the past, but catching them and sort of putting down on paper is really something which would perhaps work well as a reminder for us, as for example this training moves to its next stage. So it's also, I felt that it's inspiring to get those points on on historic lessons collected and documented.
Great. So as we get the answers in for all of these questions, I think we can thank you all for joining in today, and thank you, Zot, for giving us such an enlightening and well-structured presentation. You've given us a lot of food for thought for the next couple of days as we reflect on it. And I welcome everybody to join us for the last session, which will be on the on the 4th of March, that is Friday, same time, from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock Bangkok time, and that is 1:30 to 4:30 India time. And just as we close, I would again like to thank all of you for joining in and participating in this in these discussions and giving us such great questions that we can reflect upon. And I would thank you all for also moving forward to fill in the evaluation form that will greatly help us in improving the next session as well. So thank you all. And as the answers come in, you can just reflect on them if you want to. With that, I would like to close the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I will use the slides in my introductions on Friday just to sort of reflect and close off this session as we move into more details of the regulations on Article 6, looking at the nitty-gritty, and then obviously we will be also looking at the voluntary markets and also domestic offsets on that day. So Friday will be really diving into the details of project-based mechanisms. And I think there's word clouds, which are just now being formulated, would also help me to stand on the same feet and on the same shoes, where you are looking at the word of these beautiful complexities of offsets and project-based mechanisms. So thank you very much. For our Indonesian colleagues and friends, have a very nice holiday tomorrow. I understand that it's a public holiday there, and for all of you, well, have a good work for the rest of the week, and we will see each other the same time on Friday. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.